What's up, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of Inside the Lines with me, your host, Isaac. It's Western Conference Finals time. We have our matchups set out west. Yesterday, I was able to kind of go into a little bit of a dive into the Eastern Conference Finals, the Eastern Conference aspect between the Indiana Pacers and the Boston Celtics. I'd actually predicted that the Pacers would tie the series up yesterday. That didn't come to fruition, but now I wanted us to take a little bit more of a closer look at the Western Conference side of it, the Western Conference Finals matchup between these two teams that survived the gruel, the fight, and the grind that is the Western Conference. These are the two teams standing of the 8 teams that came into the postseason on the Western Conference side, and now it's like I said, down to the last two, right? Who has the advantage? Who's going to win the series? Who is going to have the privilege of representing the Western Conference and, in my eyes, most likely winning the NBA Finals, right? I do believe the teams out west are very superior to the teams out east, but that all remains to be seen, right? So let's, without further ado, dive into the matchup in itself. We have the third-seeded Minnesota Timberwolves hosting the fifth-seeded Dallas Mavericks. These two teams did face off earlier in the week in Game 1, a game in which the Dallas Mavericks took by a score of 108-105. This was, look, I said in the last video, I am super excited for these conference finals. I know I'd misjudged the Indiana series thus far. I expected it to be tied 1-1 going back to Indiana, but I still believe there's hope. I'm not changing my pick. I still believe that series goes 7, maybe 6, right? Not backing off of that, but at the same time, this series for sure, I know is going to live up to all the hype and all the expectation that we had going in, right? So Game 1, right? This was I don't like to sound like a broken record because I said it last night, but this was a really fun watch, right? These two teams, there's a little bit of off the court talking, not really disrespectful trash talk, but, the controversy, if you will, of Anthony Edwards after the exhilarating Game 7 win against Denver, saying in the post-game news conference, I have Kyrie Irving. I'm going to check him. I got him one-on-one. And it was very much something we were looking forward to, where analysts and everybody from the Twitter pundits and, people who enjoy watching the game were like, Ant, be careful what you wish for, because this Kyrie Irving guy, he's something special. And he gave Anthony Edwards everything he could have wanted and more. Kyrie Irving got off to an excellent start in this game. In the first half, he scored 24 points without a single three-pointer made off 11 of 14 from the field. 11 of 14 from the field, an excellent start for Kyrie Irving. And, I don't want to disparage Anthony Edwards too much. I do believe the defensive philosophy and game plan for Minnesota wasn't the greatest. The drop coverage was definitely something that has been a talking point over the past couple of days, and I don't necessarily love the strategy of using drop coverage when, the pick and roll happens, and on the pick and roll, the big defender or the screening defender, right, decides to pull back and not be up on the screen. So he pulls back a touch and he allows the guard or whoever has the ball off the pick and roll ball handler, to get to his spot if he wants to get to the rim. But the drop coverage is basically having the defensive philosophy, we got to protect the basket, right? So we'll give you anything in between from the mid-range, or if you want to dish it to a teammate, you can dish it to a teammate. And I think Kyrie ate that alive in the first half. That drop coverage, not super successful, not against just Kyrie Irving, but Luka Doncic as the game went on, right? But, I do think this was a very, very interesting and fun matchup for Kyrie. He had himself a very good first half, and Luka Doncic took over it later in the second half. But getting back to essentially the story of the game, this game was very much touch and go, nip and tuck, very close game. I didn't feel as though any team, either team, really pulled away at any point. I felt like it was very much a, very highly contested affair, back and forth. Minnesota would take the lead. Dallas would take the lead in the first half. Minnesota built on their lead and I think went up by as many as 9 in the first half. But then again, Minnesota, closing quarter seems to be a weakness of theirs. Going into the second half, an 8-point lead was cut to 6, if I'm not mistaken. So, you take a look at it from that perspective and how Minnesota closed the quarter. I think that's what kind of gave Dallas the momentum and the confidence to continue to push in the second half and to kind of make it even more of a game going forward. The second half was very much more so of a, back and forth affair, and Dallas eventually ended up pulling away towards the end due to the 15 in the fourth quarter from Luka Doncic. But overall, Kyrie Irving, like I said, had 30 points off 12 of 23 from the field. After the 24 points that he scored off 11 of 14 in the first half, he ended up finishing 1 for 9 in the second half. So not as efficient in the second half as he was in the first. And Luka Doncic himself ended up finishing with 33 points off 12 of 26 from the field. He had 8 boards and 9 assists to go along with it. PJ Washington chipped in 13 points off 4 of 10 and 2 of 8 from 3 as well, along with 7 boards. On the Minnesota side, Jaden McDaniels, like I said, 6 threes. Huge contributions. Really did a good job of helping Minnesota keep a little bit of control in the first half, not as much in the second half. And, the thing for Minnesota are the contributions like this from Jaden McDaniels, because we already know what we're going to get from him on the defensive end of the defensive side of the basketball, right? Stifling defense that honestly in the second half didn't really come to as much fruition as Minnesota would have liked, because Luka Doncic started to kind of get it going. But if you can get scoring from him like this, it's always a bonus, right? So, good, very solid, good game from Jaden McDaniels. Anthony Edwards, however, struggled, and he was a topic of conversation throughout the course of the past couple of days because, he kind of alluded to the fact that he was a little bit more tired than usual. I don't think he actually attributed it to guarding Kyrie Irving, but I do think that played a significant impact. Kyrie Irving moves a lot off the ball, and obviously on the ball, he's very tough to keep in front of anyone, right? So I think it definitely affected him. I'm curious to see how Minnesota adjusts in game 2, right? I was very much, hearing all the noise this week, listening to all the sports talk shows, and I was very much intrigued by an idea Stephen A. proposed on First Take, I think it was yesterday, which was, Anthony Edwards defensively, I like that he takes the challenge. He's one of my favorite players today because of the fact that he's very much a two-way guy. He wants to defend the opposing team's player, but I'm curious to see whether or not what Stephen A. was suggesting, sorry, I didn't actually say it, was saying, okay, we'll take Anthony Edwards off of Kyrie Irving and we'll place him on Luka Doncic, right? So he's not running around as much. He's not exerting as much energy because Luka himself isn't a crazy off-the-ball movement type guy, right? He very much is the ball in his hands and plays at his own pace, and it's not a crazy pace. He's still very difficult to defend. I don't want this to be a slight to Luka, but as much as it is a credit to how much Kyrie moves off ball, which I don't think makes anyone a better player or a worse player. But if you take Anthony Edwards and put him on a guy who doesn't move as much off ball, right, so he still has some energy to conserve to a degree on the offensive end, or that he can use on the offensive end. I'm very curious to see if Minnesota exploits that and then places Jaden McDaniels on Kyrie Irving, because Kyrie in the past has kind of been bothered by guys who are a little bit more lengthy than he is, right? When you put a lengthier guy on Kyrie, he tends to not shoot as well. So I'm curious if they make that adjustment. I'd really, really like to see if they do make that adjustment and how much success it has. But, getting back to Anthony Edwards, he finished game 1 with 19 points off 6 of 16 from the field, 5 of 12 from 3, 11 boards, and 8 assists. I felt as though watching Anthony Edwards in this game, he settled for a lot of jumpers, right? He maybe that was a result of the fatigue that he discussed from possibly chasing Kyrie Irving around, possibly from, the game 7 that he played. So I'm very curious to see if he does less settling, right? Because in this game, I have it down there, Minnesota lost the paint battle 62-28 in Dallas's favor, right? 62 points to 62 to 38 points in Dallas's favor, and that is something that is not common, as we'll see here, because we're going to take a look at the stats throughout the course of the playoffs, but Minnesota being dominated in the paint to that degree is something that doesn't really happen quite often and hasn't really happened throughout the course of this playoff. So, I think that's a result of Anthony Edwards settling a little bit, not finishing around the rim, not getting to the rim as much as he did in the previous series. So I'm wondering if they make that adjustment, if he stays on Kyrie Irving, if he does stay on Kyrie Irving, if he decides to be a little bit more aggressive getting to the paint going forward. He also finished with 11 boards and 8 assists. Karl-Anthony Towns also chipped in 16. He went 6 for 20 from the field, 2 for 9 from 3. So look at this, 9 3-point attempts for McDaniels, 12 3-point attempts for Edwards, and 9 3-point attempts for Towns. I definitely think Minnesota needs to do a better job attacking the paint, getting to the rim, if they want to have a little bit more success on the offensive side in this series. Also, the bench of Minnesota outscored Dallas 28-14, led by Naz Reid, who hit 15 off the bench. Another key thing that I looked at here for this particular game was the free throw line, right? Minnesota shooting 11 for 18 from the line is not going to get it done when you're looking to win games of this nature, especially when you end up losing by 3. 7 free throws missed and you lost a game. In a game you lost by 3 is definitely something you have to pay attention to. So, I'm very curious to see the adjustments that both teams will make going forward into game 2. But those are kind of my thoughts on game 1. So let's take a look at the series all together and how we think it shakes out, right? So far through the 2024 NBA playoffs, if we take a look at Minnesota's numbers, this is comprehensive of all the playoff games they had played up until game 1. So this is excluding game 1 of this current series. Minnesota averaged 108.4 points per game and only allowed 99.6 points per game so far in 11 games in these playoffs. Averaged 44.1 boards per game, shot 47.2% from the field and 35.8% from 3. They averaged 25.1 bench points per game and 46.9, almost 47 points in the paint per game through 11 games in this postseason. Looking at things from the Dallas side, Dallas averaged 106.5 points per game, only allowed 103.2 points per game through 12 games thus far. 43.8 points per game, or rebounds per game, and 45.9% shooting from the field, with 36.6% shooting from 3. They average about 24.5 bench points per game and 43 points per game in the paint through 12, right? So bird's eye view from both these teams, looking at what they've done in the playoffs to this point, they're very kind of similar, right? I think obviously Minnesota has been an elite defensive team. Not to say Dallas isn't, but they've been on another level this entire postseason. They've rebounded better throughout these games. They've shot better from the field. Dallas has shot slightly better from 3. Their benches are nearly identical, and their paint points are also a little bit different, right? Minnesota has the edge there in the first 11 games that they had played to this point, which makes that paint point discrepancy in game 1 very, very surprising, right? It's something that we didn't expect to see coming into this series. Now, moving on to specifically how they played in the last series in the second round, Dallas, taking a look at them first. Dallas averaged 106 points per game and allowed 106 points per game, so pretty dead even heat there. So that's a net of nothing. So they very much defended and gave up the same amount of points. Looking at it from a rebounding perspective, they were first in rebounding of teams remaining in the second round of the playoffs, and in field goal percentage, shot 45.4% from the field, 39.7% from 3. That was second in teams remaining in the postseason. So a hot shooting 3-point team that we didn't see in game 1. Remember, only shot 24% from 3. Not characteristic of what they've been thus far in the playoffs, and had 24.3 bench points per game, which was third amongst teams remaining, and had 42.7 points per game in the paint. So look at that. They were at the bottom of the teams remaining in paint points, but ended up scoring 52 in their game 1 victory against Minnesota. That's not something that we expected to see in this series so far. So definitely something we want to continue to keep our eye on are those paint points, I think, and how they continue to exploit that going forward. One thing I wanted to bring our attention to, though, in addition to what we had seen in these statistics, is that defensive rating at the bottom. Dallas was 111.8 in defensive rating in that series against Oklahoma. To put that in perspective, throughout the course of the regular season, the Miami Heat finished with the 6th best defensive rating in the entire NBA of the 30 teams. at 111.5, right? That was fifth. So if Dallas's level of defensive rating that they had in the last series against Oklahoma City would have put them at sixth in the league in defensive rating. So a top six defensive team based off the defensive rating that they had in the previous series. So this is an elite defensive team, right? This is a team that not only can get you with Luka and Kyrie in terms of how they score offensively, but they can actually do a good job of keeping you from scoring themselves, right? Looking at things from the Minnesota perspective, right? In the last round against the Denver Nuggets, they averaged 102 points per game and only gave up 97.6 points per game. Averaged 42.9 boards per game, shot 47% from the field and 35.3% from three, had 24 bench points per game and averaged 44.9 points per game. So juxtapose that here, those paint points, looking at Dallas only being seventh in the paint, or seventh amongst teams remaining of points in the paint, and Minnesota being fourth amongst teams that are scoring in the paint. It's very, very much something, like I said, we're going to keep our eye on going forward. But looking at that defensive rating there for Minnesota, they finished with a defensive rating in that series against Denver of 106.6. And let's put this in perspective for how they performed all year. They were the best defense in the NBA the entire season with a defensive rating of 108.6. And in a series against Denver, the second best team in the West, they finished with a defensive rating of 106.6. So even outclassed what they did in the regular season in that series against Denver. Very, very, very impressive defensive team here for Minnesota and how they've looked in that last series. So, going forward in this series, what is the expectation? What matters? What do these teams need to do to gain that advantage and to potentially win this series for the opportunity to represent the Western Conference in the NBA Finals? Well, first things first, it's going to come on the defensive side of the basketball, right? The defensive side of the basketball matters so crucially in this series. I think it was almost personified in Ant declaring that he was going to check Kyrie in before game one, right? These are two extremely gifted defensive teams, right? Both these teams were in the top 10 in defensive rating in the last 15 games of the year. Dallas was number 1, Minnesota at number 8. These teams are both elite defensive teams. I know I'm kind of repeating myself here, but I'm trying to emphasize the level of importance the defense will carry in this series. And it starts with guys like Anthony Edwards and Jaden McDaniels and Rudy Gobert and Nickeil Alexander-Walker off the bench. And on Dallas' side, Kyrie Irving, who's been an excellent defender so far this postseason. It starts with P.J. Washington and Daniel Gafford and Derek Lively and Derek Jones Jr. All these guys need to make sure that they're on the same page defensively, and most importantly, Luka. Luka needs to be as good defensively as he's been the last 4 games, right? He has been very, very solid defensively. It had been a point of contention coming into this postseason. Could Luka find a way to be engaged on the defensive side of the ball? Could he find a way to impact the defensive side of the ball? And not only that, but not be a liability defensively. And I think so far this postseason, he's done just that. So defense matters. Whoever defends will likely win this series, and I know that's a very basic and easy thing to see and say, but with the level of defense that we've seen between these two teams so far this postseason, it's going to be very, very interesting to see who can gain that advantage on the defensive side of the ball, because to me, I give Minnesota that advantage with the level of defense they played in that Denver series, how stifling they were, how suffocating they were defensively, how unlike themselves Jamal Murray and Nikola Jokic seemed, especially in the second half of that Game 7. We have to kind of give them the nod and the advantage, even though Dallas wasn't particularly bad in that series against Oklahoma City. Next, it's the paint battle, right? The paint battle is so crucial because it's the easiest way to score. It should be, in theory, the easiest way to score. So the paint battle in Game 1, to me, decided the game, right? Dallas was able to score 52 points in the paint compared to Minnesota's 38, and to me, 62 as opposed to Minnesota's 38. I apologize. So when you take a look at the 62 points that Dallas scored in the paint compared to Minnesota's 38, that to me decides the game, right? They were getting anything they wanted, namely guys like Kyrie Irving, namely guys like Luka Doncic, and them getting guys like Daniel Gafford and Derek Lively involved. I think it very much didn't bode well for Minnesota in that series. I still give Minnesota a slight advantage in scoring in the paint because of the fact that I believe if Karl-Anthony Towns decides that he wants to put his head down, get in the post, and finish in the post, I think he has that advantage. I think Rudy Gobert can give them second chance points and finish in the paint as well. I think Anthony Edwards, if he puts his head down, I'm not sure if there's anybody on Dallas that can really contend and keep him in front of them. So I do like Minnesota's paint advantage, even though Dallas was victorious in game one and controlled the paint. So it's going to be interesting to see how that happens going forward. Now, I mentioned the glass, Rudy Gobert on the offensive glass. The glass is very important as well. Rebounding numbers need to be emphasized in this series. In game one, Dallas did win the rebounding battle 48-40. So not only did they win the paint battle, but the rebounding battle as well. It just goes to show you that I think that inside presence, keeping the easiest way to score alive as an option and something you can exploit, right, is going to be why you can win these games, why you can win close games like the one they won in game one, right? Why you can compete and continue to have the level of dominance in these series going forward. So they have to control the paint, they have to control the glass with the inside presence. Number three is role players, right? Look, Minnesota had a great showing from Jaden McDaniels in game one. He had 4 points off 6 of 9 shooting from three. That is very impressive. And PJ Washington did have 13. So guys like PJ Washington, guys like Jaden McDaniels, guys like Mike Conley, guys like Nickeil Alexander-Walker and Derrick Jones Jr. and Tim Hardaway Jr., all these guys are going to play a role in this series. Whose role players show up in a way and contribute more in this series? And I think it's a bit of a wash. I don't have a pick on who I think has the advantage there, so I'm going to say it's a wash. And then last but not least is coaching, right? When you take a look at coaching for these two teams, right, and who can get that advantage coaching-wise, I take a look at it, and I'm kind of leaning towards Dallas. I think Dallas has that advantage. I think Jason Kidd, having the benefit of the doubt of already being in a conference finals, definitely moves me more than Chris Finch. Chris Finch / Mike Onori. Obviously, Chris Finch with that knee injury is he's still on the sidelines, but he's not, active and walking like Mike Onori is. But taking a look at that perspective, I just kind of like the advantage of coaching going to Dallas and the adjustments they want to make and how they want to play their rotations. I like Dallas's advantage there. So as far as defense goes, I like Minnesota. Paint battle and glass battle, I like Minnesota there as well. Role players, I like. I don't really know who I like. I do think, I'm going to change my mind here on the fly. I do think Dallas's role players are a little bit better. PJ Washington, Derrick Jones Jr., Derek Lively, Daniel Gafford, all those pieces, I think will have more of an advantage in this series because of the fact that Luka and Kyrie will demand so much attention, and they've been so willing to have those guys make big shots and big spots so far in these playoffs. So I'm going to give the role players and coaching edge to Dallas. Now, as far as key players goes, we got to start with Anthony Edwards. I mean, he has looked spectacular thus far in these NBA playoffs. He's been the guy. I think he's been thus far the best player in the playoff. In that series versus Denver, he averaged 27.7 points per game off 50% from the field and 37.3% shooting from three, averaged 5.1 boards and 5.7 assists per game. And get this, through the entirety of the 2024 playoffs, these stats are reflective of the games, not including this last game against Dallas in game one. Through the entirety of the 2024 NBA playoffs, he's holding opponents to 38% from the field and 31% from three as the primary defender. Very, very impressive numbers. So he's getting it done offensively and he's getting it done defensively, right? I've always had an admiration for guys who play two ways, right? The Kawhi Leonards of the world, the LeBron Jameses in his prime of the world, the Anthony Davises of the world, guys who could defend and not only defend but score. Impacting both sides of the ball, to me, is indicative of how great you are as a player. And I think Anthony Edwards has showcased his greatness thus far in this postseason. So I'm looking for him to continue to kind of get back on track. The last 2 games he hasn't shot the ball particularly well. I'm expecting that to change here in game 2. Next person I kind of wanted to focus on, next player that I wanted to bring up was Luka Doncic, who is kind of the de facto best players in this series, right? Best player, in this series. Now, obviously, I think Anthony Edwards has played the best out of any player in the postseason thus far, but Luka Doncic to me is the best player left, right? Luka, he has the skills offensively, right? We know there are the struggles that are there defensively, but offensively, we really take a look at what he does. He can score and he gets his teammates involved, right? He started off a little rocky from the field, didn't shoot the ball particularly well in that series against the Clippers, averaged 40.5% from the field, but still had the numbers in that series, had 29.8 points per game against the Clippers, 8.8 rebounds per game, and 9.5 assists against the Clippers. But I think he showed way more improvement in that series against Oklahoma City in the conference semis. He averaged 24.7 points per game, while 44.7% from the field and 39.7% from 3. Right, had 10 boards and 9.3 assists in that series against OKC as well. Luka, he hasn't really been himself, right? I don't think I've seen a game from Luka in the playoffs where I thought this is a complete Luka game in terms of efficiency and the scoring element. So I'm still kind of waiting for that game. Up until this point, I think he's played well, but not well in terms of what we expect from him up to his standards, right? We expect Luka to have that level of efficiency that he hasn't really showcased thus far in the postseason. So expecting him to play better, I think this is a series where he can take advantage of Minnesota's length, of Minnesota's athleticism, just by being himself, right? So I'm expecting to see a big series from Luka. Kyrie Irving, the next guy I wanted to touch on. Look, Kyrie Irving, full disclosure, is my favorite player in the NBA. Right, this guy can give it to you in the paint. He can finish around the rim. One of the best finishers in NBA history. He has the three-point shot. He has the mid-range down. He can get his teammates involved. But the biggest thing about Kyrie that we are seeing this postseason that we haven't seen in years past is not only the leadership, but the intensity on the defensive end of the floor. This season, this postseason, through 12 games, Kyrie Irving is holding opponents to 42.6% from the field and forced 14 turnovers and had 12 blocks through those 12 games. Kyrie Irving really, really getting after it defensively. And you know, they're talking about it more and more. The experts, the sports shows, they're talking about it more and more. But I feel like still it's not talked about enough how he's competing defensively. He's taking it personally. He's leading by example, and they're following his lead. Right? I mean, obviously, there have been things off the court that people always like to bring up with Kyrie Irving in terms of things in his past that didn't exactly go the way he wanted it to go. But at the end of the day, I think in Dallas, he's found a level of happiness. He's found a level of peace, and he's showcasing that through his play, right? Showcasing it through the leadership and leading these teammates as well. So I really think he's going to play an important role in this series. But one of the biggest things for Kyrie that I really admire this postseason is him not forcing it. Him saying, okay, let me allow P.J. Washington to get going. Let me allow Derrick Jones Jr. to get going. Let me allow Derek Lively to get a few buckets, because I think he recognizes, hey, if these guys get going, not only is it good for their confidence, but they defend even harder going forward in games like this. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing how Kyrie Irving performs. I do think both him and Luka had very, very successful game ones. So let's see what happens going forward. And last but not least, Karl-Anthony Towns. Karl-Anthony Towns is going to play a huge role in this series, and I picked him specifically because of how well he had played in that Game 7 against Denver, right? In Game 7 against Denver, he led the team in scoring with 23 points and rebounding with 12 boards. So I'm very intrigued to see what he does in this series. You know, he averaged 18 points per game through the entirety of the conference semifinals against Denver. So I'm very much expecting him to play a lot better than he did in Game 1, and I'm excited to see how he responds to how they played in that Game 1 series, or in that Game 1 against Dallas. So those are kind of my key points, my key elements to this series, key players, and what matters most. To be quite frank with you, my prediction still stands as Minnesota to take it in 7. I'm not going to be overly discouraged by game 1. It's a long series. Game 1s are typically very, very they're not very indicative of how a series always plays out. So I'm very much going to reserve changing my pick because I had changed my picks in the past in terms of being overreactionary. I'm not gonna do that this time. But I do think they'll be in trouble if Dallas does end up taking game 2. But that being said, I'm picking Minnesota to take this series in 7. But I do want to pay my respect to Dallas. I do believe they are fully capable of winning this series. This series could go either way, right? I believe both these teams are very good defensive teams. I do believe Dallas has the offensive edge, but I'm very much a defense wins championships type guy, and the level of defense that Minnesota has played and exhibited thus far in the postseason, along with their advantage that I think that they have in the paint and on the glass potentially, I think that'll be enough to carry them to their first NBA Finals appearance. So once again, picking them in 7, picking the TimBerwolves in 7, which means, of course, I expect them to take tonight's game 2 by a score of 107-95. So expecting Minnesota to tie the series, and we'll see what happens after that. But you let me know what you think is going to happen in the comment section below. Do you think Dallas takes it in 7 or less, or do you agree with me and thinks Minnesota takes it in even less than 7? Right? Let me know in the comment section below, and we'll follow up on the results of this game, not only this game, but also the Indiana-Boston series as well here in the next couple of days. So, it's like I said, let me know what you think in the comment section below. Please like and subscribe. And until next time, we hope you keep it inside the lines.